Welcome to Talkless Water, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. My name is Todd Vottler, and I'm your host for Talkless Water. I'm also principal of Collaborative Water Resolution, which you can find at waterdisputes.org. In addition, I'm editor-in-chief of Texas with Water and the Texas Water Journal. Both publications are free. My guest today is Daniel Rothberg. Daniel is a writer who focuses on research on water, public land, mining, and energy. He writes a newsletter focused on water in the Western United States. For 6 years, Daniel worked as an environmental reporter for the Nevada Independent, where his work was recognized by the Society of Professional Journalists, also Best of the West, and the Society of Environmental Journalists. During that time, Daniel served as president of the Nevada Press Association, working to support and advocate on behalf of outlets across the state. Daniel's environmental writing has been published in the Nevada Independent, the New York Times, Smithsonian, Inside Climate News, Sierra Magazine, Vox, and High Country News. He's currently based in Davis, California, where he's working for a master's in environmental policy at UC Davis, University of California, Davis. And this is probably a good point for me to tell you, Daniel, that I have a rule that if you use an acronym, you got to tell us what it is first.
So I try not to use any, so I'll try my best.
Good. Well, so getting back on script here, Daniel, welcome to Talkless Water.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start out with your background. Additional background. When did you first become interested in water issues?
That's a really great question. I grew up in Southern California in LA, and I think like a lot of people, I didn't really think that much about rivers or groundwater, freshwater in general. I love the ocean. I thought I was an ocean person,
right.
But I didn't really think that much about where my water was coming from, which I'm, a little embarrassed to admit. I will say, my mom, I have to credit her a lot for my interest in water because she was always talking about the drought, got to take shorter showers, and all that stuff. And, but I really growing up had no sense of kind of where my water was coming from. I really wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to be a writer. I was always very interested in kind of systems, what's sort of behind the systems behind what we see and, how we interact with supply chains and things like that. But, I didn't really initially go into journalism thinking that I would write about water. I first started writing about water when I was working at the Las Vegas Sun in 2015. And we're right there by Lake Mead. The newsroom is probably 30 minutes from Lake Mead. Mm-hmm. And in 2015, there was sort of a crisis on the Colorado River. There's always been a crisis on the Colorado River of some form or another in the past few decades. But, I asked my editor kind of if I could. I was covering energy at the time, which was interesting to me for a variety of similar reasons that water is interesting to me. We turn on our light switch, but we don't always think about where our energy is coming from. And I asked my editor if I could go, start covering water because no one in the newsroom was. And I was like, this is probably the most important thing affecting Las Vegas right now.
Yeah.
And because of where the news industry was and, they were just happy for content and for me to cover anything. So they sent me out and I became really fascinated with it. It fused so much of the things I was already interested in. Politics. I was a political science major as an undergrad. So, the politics and policy part was fascinating. It was completely in many ways kind of divorced from the, partisan politics that we see, or the issues are much more localized. I love history, and, all of these water issues were rooted in this kind of like deep historical context and framework. And, I'm really interested in science and, environmental science. And there was just so much there to learn, and just kind of fusing all those disciplines. There's just so much to explore.
Right. It's interesting how water does that, but not just and I know there are other folks who are water journalists, right? And they're just totally fascinated with the subject. But you see this when, for example, you have people appointed to boards that are water boards of various kinds.
Yeah.
And they may be doctors or attorneys or business people or, or scientists whatever they are, their background might not be associated with water, but then they become involved with it. And it's hard to give up. And they don't really, when their time comes for them to get off that board, they're not always that happy about it, because they're like, gosh, really gotten into this, all these water issues. And they just, are fascinated with that work. And I just find, it's kind of cross-cutting, in terms of lots of different professions, when whatever their part of it might be, when they get, the chance to work on some water issues, it's just hard to give up.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I was really lucky. So I started writing about water in 2015, 2016, when I was at the Las Vegas Sun. And then I was really fortunate to be able to go on this. There's this great organization called the Institute for Journalism and Natural Resources, and they organize trips of journalists all across the country on different issues, not just water issues, a wide array of environmental issues. And I was lucky to go on one that was focused on the lower Colorado River. And we started in Vegas, and we made our way all the way down sort of the river through Arizona into California, Imperial County, down into Mexico, and then came back. And just seeing the different kind of social relationships to water, cultural relationships to water, geographic, physical constraints, was just really fascinating to me. And I could also see, a really important role for journalism in water. I always wanted to write about things that other people weren't necessarily writing about, or where there were gaps in storytelling. And because water is so tied to place, it really takes reporters going out, people calling. It's not the type of reporting you can kind of just do when people are sending you press releases. You really have to go out and ground truth. And I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed doing interviews and things like that. And so it was a great fit. And the deeper I've gone down, the more I'm interested and the more questions I have.
So there was a program here in Texas several years ago, or maybe it's even 10 years or more ago, where there would be a tour that would go down, for example, a river basin in multiple days, and have stops and look at some of the important features, whether they were dams or some kind of other diversion structure, or a wetland, or some other feature, and then get exposed to what are the issues along the way. There would be education associated with that. And I know there's a program that is doing that in California. But I always kind of lament the fact that we don't have that one still going here in Texas. But sounds like it was a major turning point for you in terms of your interest and background in water.
Yeah. And it was also just a really, it's interesting because water, every watershed is different. Every watershed is unique in different ways. But I think that that experience also just it gave me a little bit of a framework for some of the central problems that are facing a lot of communities in the West, even even in places where the watersheds, are physically different, which is, this problem of over allocation, there being more rights to water on paper than there is water to go around, and how you reconcile that with other priorities and equities and considerations. I took that knowledge back with me, when I was reporting in Nevada and going to different communities or watersheds, whether it's the Walker River or the Humboldt River or the Muddy River in Nevada. And these are, much, much smaller. Nevada's a dry state in the nation, so these are much, much smaller systems than the Colorado River. But you can hear these echoes in different places, which is really, I think, interesting and gave me a really unique perspective.
So most of the Western water issues you covered, have they been associated with Nevada? And I guess Nevada's portion of the Colorado River and also groundwater issues, or have you had a chance to dip your toes in, some of those issues outside of Nevada?
Yeah, so most of the issues I've covered have been related to Nevada in one shape or form. I've largely Nevada's an interesting state because the only river in Nevada that is just within the state's boundary is the Humboldt River, which sort of runs in the middle of Nevada. But all of the other rivers in Nevada have their headwaters somewhere else. So the Colorado River, in the headwater states, Wyoming, Colorado, in the Truckee River and the Walker River, both originate in California, the Oahe. So it's interesting, like the governance structure, it's about Nevada, but it also necessarily includes a lot of other states. I've done some reporting on a groundwater basin that straddles a line between Utah and Nevada and some of the negotiations around sharing water there. So I'm somewhat familiar with other states, but my reporting is largely focused on Nevada and the Great Basin. So the Eastern Sierra. So the Great Basin kind of spans from Eastern California to Western Utah, and then north to south from Southern Oregon and Idaho to Nevada to Southern Oregon and Idaho on the north side to Southern Nevada on the south side of the Great Basin. And even though, the Great Basin includes a lot of different states, the watersheds are all unique in their own ways, but also in similar ways in that the water in the Great Basin stays in the Great Basin. A lot of these, pretty much all of these watersheds are not connected to the ocean in any way. So, whether we're talking about the Owens River or the Walker River, they all drain into these closed basins and these closed lakes. So there's a lot of similar. The Great Salt Lake is a good example of that, where you have this kind of closed lake at the end of a watershed or river system.
So the way that I first became connected with you is I started to read Western Water Notes, your newsletter. And I was like, wow, this is really great. And so, tell us about that. Tell listeners about your newsletter.
Yeah. So the newsletter has been really great way to connect with sources and readers and a lot of different people that are writing about water, thinking about water, working in water. I started a newsletter last year. And for me, it was just another sort of way to get my writing out and work out. I started freelancing last year, and I just had, a lot of story ideas and, information that I wanted to get out and communicate. And the newsletter offered a really good platform for doing that. it's been, it's still sort of, I'll admit, kind of an experiment and a work in progress for me to sort of figure out the format and, what works best. Some of my posts are sort of looking at a wide array of issues and kind of aggregating from different places. And some of them are, based off of my reporting and interviews and research. But for me, I really believe that, and I should say I'm familiar with water in the West. I'm not as familiar with water in the East, but, a lot of state constitutions in the Western US or state laws in the Western US, enshrine water as being owned by the public, owned by the people of the state. And because water is a public resource, I see a really important role for communication and people to be watching what is going on, whether that's what's going on with politics, whether that's what's going on with policy or science, because it is sort of this shared and public resource. Even though we do have layers of usufructuary rights, which is a term I learned fairly recently, but we have these layers of private property rights that are really important for how these systems work and for allocating water. But at the end of the day, it being sort of this public resource, I see communication as a really important part of the puzzle in managing and thinking about water.
So what Western water issues do you find to be the most fascinating?
I think two things come to mind. The first is the issue I briefly mentioned when we were talking a little bit about that Colorado River trip, which is this issue of over allocation. In many parts of the West, this is true in Nevada, but it's also true in other places. There's more rights to use water than there is water to go around. So there's just more rights on paper than there is water, flowing through a stream or river. That problem has deepened as we've seen these, extensive drought periods, which, a lot of scientists are calling aridification, climate-driven drought. That is changing sort of the long-term supply in some of these snowpack-fed systems in the West. So the problem of overallocation in some places is becoming worse. In the West, we have this system of prior appropriation to deal with the imbalance of supply and demand. In theory, in theory, it's first come, first serve. Those who have water rights first in time are the first to priority. Have the first priority to use water in times of scarcity or times of drought. But in reality, because that system is blind to a lot of other considerations about, how water is used and where water is used and, public safety, health in urban areas and the economic use of water in agricultural areas. My experience, at least in Nevada, is state regulators are very cautious about actually curtailing and using that sort of catch-all prior appropriation tool to regulate. In some places, it works really well, and it's the rules. But in other places, it is a driver of a lot of negotiation and voluntary agreement around how to manage water, and so. Thinking about how overallocation is resolved within these frameworks that were set up, about a century ago, assuming a different climate and, a different sort of demographic and geography of the West, I think is really interesting to me because you're having to kind of reconcile these priorities and interests of today with a framework that is still, very much the legal framework for managing water in the West, but is a framework that was set up at a different time. So thinking about that, is one area that really fascinates me. And then also layering into that all the just sort of the changing ways that we value water today. The prior appropriation system was set up at a time where the goal was to use every single drop of a river. It was to use every single drop of a stream, a groundwater basin, and that caused a lot of environmental destruction. Prior appropriation systems were often blind to tribal water rights. So thinking about how the system can become more just and evolve to incorporate indigenous water rights and environmental flows is also part of that larger discussion, I think, about overallocation. The second thing that is fascinating to me is groundwater, because Nevada and Utah and some other states were actually pretty proactive in managing groundwater and creating a permitting system and appropriative system back in the 30s and 40s. But a lot of states are now just starting to really regulate groundwater, like Arizona and California. And it's really hard to do. It is really hard to, I think it's really hard on a just a policy level, because groundwater is a blind resource. It's sometimes hard to quantify what recharges or, discharge and find what the right balance is. But it's also hard, I think, just because, in a lot of cases, because we don't see groundwater and we only see the impacts after depletion or when there's a conflict, it's easier to just sort of kick the can down the road.
So, focusing back on the Great Basin, what are some of the current issues going on in the Great Basin that you're covering, you're following?
Yeah. So I think a few issues, one, dealing with this issue of overallocation is a priority in a lot of places. And then thinking about watersheds as a more holistic system than we have in the past. In this case, I'm referring specifically to Nevada. For a century, basically, regulators viewed groundwater and surface water as a separate resource. In fact, it's only until I was going to say last year, but I think it was at the start of this year that the Nevada Supreme Court recognized the hydrologic connection between groundwater and surface water. So in a lot of places like the Humboldt River watershed, which if you've ever driven from Salt Lake City to Reno or San Francisco, you're passing the Humboldt River watershed for a large portion of that drive. And it's a very small river. It's a meandering river. And there's extensive groundwater pumping that has taken place in adjacent groundwater basins to the river. What that has caused is depletion of the river's base flows, capture of the river's base flows, both for agricultural water use, but also for mining water use, for the dewatering of mines. There's huge, massive gold mines in the Humboldt River basin. And so regulators are really trying to figure out how to manage these two historically separate, in policy terms, historically separate sources, groundwater and surface water, that the entire time have actually been physically connected, and kind of reconciling the science with the policy and recognizing the reality that, there is just not enough water to go around and to fulfill all the commitments on the river. So that's one area I'm really interested in and looking at, because it is a microcosm of what's going on in a lot of parts of the Great Basin, where there is strong connection between groundwater and surface water, and they haven't been managed together in the past. And now the Nevada Supreme Court has recognized that they're connected. I think there's going to be a lot of management activities around that. The Great Basin's unique because I think 85% or so of the map streams are intermittent or ephemeral. And so there's just a really big sensitivity around base flows, groundwater use, things like that in the Great Basin. Some other issues I'm looking at are kind of I'm really interested in sort of collaborative governance, community approaches to solving water problems. So, looking at in cities, kind of rebate programs for cash for grass, demand reduction and things like that, and then discussions around groundwater management plans and how communities can come together to reduce water use in a way that provides sort of a softer landing and potentially leads to sort of less conflict and litigation. Because frankly, in my time covering water in Nevada, I used to joke that every time the state engineer, which was the state's top water regulator, did anything, they would get a summons the next day and be in court for the next couple of years.
Lots of litigation in water. Yep.
Yeah,
for sure. Sure. And so I want to come back to the groundwater issue here in a minute. But first, tell us what's going on with the Colorado River right now. And of course, for our listeners in Texas, I'm not talking about that Colorado River. I'm talking about the one out west, the big one. I know that there are some negotiations going on right now. There are important negotiations. At the same time, the drought is not what it was. And so there may be a little less of, the pressure that had been forming on the folks who are, probably sitting in a room, trying to make some long-term decisions about the Colorado. So what's going on with that river right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we're going to be hearing a lot about the Colorado River in the next year or so because the 7 states in the Colorado River Basin are negotiating operating guidelines for the management of the river. The guidelines that are currently in place were agreed to in 2007. And they expire in 2026. So they have about, a year or so. I mean, frankly, they have less time because all this stuff has to be reviewed through the environmental review process. But essentially, I'll step back and talk about the guidelines that were agreed to in 2007. Those were, at the height of what people then thought was sort of the worst case scenario for the Colorado River, serious deep drought. And so those were really agreements to cut back on use. And when the main reservoirs on the Colorado River dropped below certain levels. So, the 2 main reservoirs on the Colorado River are Lake Mead and Lake Powell. So the operating guidelines really focused on how to balance those 2 reservoirs. And when Lake Mead dropped below certain levels, it required the states downstream, Nevada, Arizona, and California to just Nevada and Arizona in those original plans to reduce use because California has priority water rights. Since that, those plans, frankly, were insufficient for what was to come on the Colorado River. The drought that the Colorado River has seen over the last 20 years has been the worst drought according to researchers who do paleoclimate work in the last 1,200 years. So this mega drought forced people to come back to the table early. They had to come back in 2019 and negotiate a new drought contingency plan. That plan forced or required, I shouldn't say forced because it was a voluntary agreement, but sort of a voluntary mandatory agreement. It required Nevada, Arizona, and California came to the table to take cuts too if Lake Mead fell to certain levels. The reason that the cuts fell on the states in the lower basin of the river, California, Nevada, Arizona, and Mexico has also contributed to cutbacks too, is because those states have used their full Colorado River allocation, and historically they've used an excess. So the onus was on them to cut back, and they've cut back significantly since that time. Now the negotiations are really focused on what happens in the future. The river is much smaller than the Colorado River Compact assumed in 1922 on average over the last 100 years. But if you look at just the last 20 years of this mega drought, it is much, much smaller than it was assumed to be in 1922. And so you're seeing a lot of anxiety and tension around how to live within the means of this much smaller Colorado River. The lower basin states of Arizona, California, and Nevada are basically saying to the headwater states upstream, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming, that these cuts should be shared across the basin. The lower basin understands they're using more, they have to cut back. But once the lake falls to these critical levels where it's reaching dead pool, and threatening water supplies across the Southwest, the lower basin is basically saying we all need to cut back. It's our responsibility to cut back. The upper basin states have been really reticent to cut back because they've never used their full allocation from the Colorado River Compact. And they basically are saying this is totally unfair. We still have plans to grow. And we don't have a reservoir upstream of us. We don't have extensive storage that we can just pull on in dry years. In dry years, we're just cut off. And so they have put out a proposal basically, saying that the lower basin needs to do even more. How this gets resolved is a huge question mark, and it's a huge question mark for the entire Southwest. There's 40 million people in the Colorado River Basin. Much of the nation's winter vegetables come from Yuma and Imperial, Yuma in Arizona and Imperial County in California. So this is a huge, huge national issue, frankly. And really at the core is this tension about the Colorado River Compact from 100 plus years ago, that just assumed that there was more water than there is. And there are fundamental language interpretation issues in the Colorado River Compact that just have never been resolved or litigated under this kind of scarcity situation that the basin is facing. And I think that there are really two options. Either those disagreements of interpretation about the compact will be negotiated among the 7 states, and they'll come to some kind of consensus or compromise, or they will be looking at litigation. I think everyone wants to avoid the litigation approach because frankly, that's an even larger question mark, because the situation we've seen on the Colorado River, that if there's 2 back-to-back years of extreme drought of low spring runoff, you could be looking at a very dire situation very quickly. And I think it's very unlikely that any litigation, of this magnitude would be resolved in 2 years. And it's also a big question mark because you're putting, you're putting all of these different interests of all of these different water users, because while there's these 7 states and they all have negotiators who all have their own personalities, they're all representing large constituencies of a lot of different water users that have different priorities. You're putting their fate in the hands of justices that might be unfamiliar with, some of these Western water issues. And that is not me to, be questioning the legal system or anything like that. But, that's just what I've heard doing interviews with a lot of lawyers who are watching this and are involved with some of these agencies.
Right. Well, do you see some of the rulings that have come out in the last few years? I mean, I don't know how you couldn't question that. Well, let me ask you this. Is one thing I, kind of wondered about, and that is that there's not more litigation because, other states, I look at, how water disputes have gone there, and particularly these multi-year disputes. And, there's usually by this time a whole bunch of lawsuits, pending someplace. And but the Colorado River just hadn't seemed to happen yet. And so that's always been a bit of a mystery to me.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because really over the past 20 years, since that 2007 guidelines, and even before then, the Colorado River has been a example of collaborative water governance, of people coming together and saying, we can negotiate, we can come to some kind of collective agreement rather than going to court, which, was a big risk for everybody. There was a landmark Supreme Court case or a landmark case that went to the Supreme Court, Arizona versus California. I think 1968, but I'm not sure. And I think that, a lot of people want to avoid that. It was costly. It took years, and it didn't necessarily settle some of these fundamental problems, on the Colorado River. I think an outcome of Arizona versus California is that in the lower basin states, there is a federal role for the Department of Interior to be the water master in the lower basin states. And so we've seen the federal government kind of push the states along in the past, in the 2000s to get this drought agreement, recently to get another layer of cuts, because the past agreements were insufficient. And so the federal government has created like this kind of incentive, because they could curtail by priority. There is this incentive to come together and negotiate beyond sort of something that is more flexible and works for more people than a strict application of priority or something like that. I think that is starting to potentially fray a little bit. Like there is a lot of conflict right now between the upper basin states and the lower basin states about the future of the river. It took people a really long time to recognize that climate change was, a real thing that they had to plan for. And now everybody recognizes it, but the reality of using less water is really hard for people to swallow. And so I'm kind of curious to see what happens. I think, because the Colorado River has, there's 100-year history of treaties and, what they call the law of the river, all these agreements and compacts. Some of these kind of fundamental questions from the Colorado River Compact, this foundational document, have not been litigated. So, that leaves this room for people to kind of develop their own legal arguments and have different interpretations of what their responsibilities are.
So let's come back to groundwater now. Overall, what are some of the trends you're seeing in Western groundwater?
Yeah, so I think much more attention is being paid to groundwater in the West, and also in the High Plains and in other parts of the country. Even groundwater. Right before I came on this podcast with you, I actually saw that the White House released a big report on groundwater, looking at potentially kind of a national role for or a role for the federal government to play in sort of coordinating efforts to tackle groundwater depletion. My understanding of groundwater also comes from first and foremost from my experience reporting in the Great Basin. There was a lot of interest because Nevada is the driest state in the nation, and the Great Basin is one of the driest regions in the nation. We have these small surface water systems. I mean, I think Mark Twain once said, and everyone in Nevada is always going around quoting Mark Twain because he lived in Virginia City for a little while. But I think Mark Twain once said, like, this is, a river in Nevada is like a creek anywhere else in the country. And it's true. And so the surface waters of the state were appropriated really quickly. And there was a early interest in groundwater. And with, rural electricity and things like that, it became very easy, and the cost just penciled out to switch to groundwater. It was more reliable in many years, and so you saw this sort of explosion of groundwater pumping in basins across the state and in other places in the West too. I did a story in Idaho earlier this year, and it was a very similar situation of this sort of explosion of groundwater pumping in the 50s and 60s. In many cases, and I think this in part has to do with our understanding of the science, but in part just has to do with the political pressures to develop more water and bring more land into production. In many places in Nevada, this was true in Idaho too. The state allocated more rights to water, or allowed more land to be permitted for groundwater pumping than there was water to go around. And so you see these huge lowering of water tables, subsidence. You see, geologic impacts, just sort of cracks in the land. And you see huge amounts of spring depletion. That's a huge issue in Nevada is the effect of groundwater on groundwater dependent ecosystems like springs, wetlands, and surface water sources. And I would say the drought has, in addition to making people more aware of, our impacts on streams and rivers, it's also made people more aware of groundwater depletion and the need to actually do something about it. Like I said, some states had a head start, like Nevada, but other states are now just getting to regulating groundwater. So in California, in 2014, the state passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, SGMA, and we're 10 years into that process. And I'm not a SGMA expert at all, but I know that has, I know people see a need for SGMA, but I also know that it's created a lot of tension has been a just huge undertaking with the creation of a lot of new agencies and things like that, and questions about what to prioritize in that process. With so many groundwater dependent ecosystems and things like that, and community systems that are dependent on groundwater. So I just see, groundwater is fascinating to me because it is I think water systems are often invisible to a lot of us a lot of the time. We turn on, we're very fortunate to, in many places, to be able to turn on the tap and access water, but we don't always think about the systems and the places where this water is coming from and the impacts of that. And I think groundwater is, even more invisible. We don't always, we can see these expressions of groundwater on landscapes and in springs and in wetlands, but we don't interact with groundwater in the same way. And I think people are becoming more aware of how groundwater plays into portfolios, plays into the water system at large. But I think it's coming in some places 20, 30 years later than maybe it should have.
So, kind of thinking broadly here, what's your sense of the public's interest in water issues? And I bet I can guess what it is, but go ahead.
I think people are very interested when there's a drought, and people are very interested when there's, extensive flooding. But
right.
A lot of the time, I think that people, especially in urban areas, are not really thinking about where their water is coming from. And, in the West, we are in a really arid part of the country, with pretty extensive water systems. I go back to growing up in Southern California. My water came from the Owens Valley. It came from the State Water Project. Reno and LA are probably 350, 400 miles away. I don't know the exact number, but, I lived closer to, to the source of my water in my childhood when I lived in Reno than I did when I lived in LA, because, Reno is pretty close to the Feather River, which feeds into the State Water Project, which goes all the way down the state of California. So, I think that, people are paying more attention. Like there's an understanding with climate change that, there's a lot of uncertainty, about how our systems are going to continue to function, especially with water. Even in places where there aren't significant changes in precipitation, like total volume of precipitation, changes in how that precipitation falls, whether it's snow or rain, and at what elevations, can have a huge impact on our, on our system, our reservoir systems in the West, because we, rely on this steady stream of snow melt. I think that, local communities are really engaged in water, especially if they're, I think in a lot of places there are huge justice issues around water access. There's huge issues around, the threats of curtailment, things like that do affect local communities. And I think local communities are really engaged. And I've seen in Nevada and other places some really sustained efforts to continue raising awareness for water issues. But it's really tough because when, when the media and the public are really only, paying attention when there's a drought, it has an effect on policymakers too. It's hard to get the attention of policymakers, when they're not getting 300 emails a day from constituents. They too are, susceptible to tuning in during a drought or a flood and not necessarily paying attention in the rest of the time.
Right. When you've got a bill having to do with water that is going through the legislature, you're always hoping for a drought here in Texas because, it'll get a lot of attention. Otherwise it might not. And But I agree with you what you say about the local interest in water. When water projects or development projects that require water, for example, a water permit, when those are in the news, they generate a lot of interest because they're local, right?
Yeah.
And when you don't have a big drought or a big flood going on, otherwise those larger issues, tend to not be ones that get a lot of attention. And I noticed this pattern for 15 or 20 years when I was working for River Authority here in Texas, is that you'd have a drought, and all of a sudden the major newspapers would have the water report, right? Or it would say environmental report.
Yeah.
And then, a year or so after that, and they'd have a section for those articles, right? And then a year or so after that drought ended, nope, no more environmental report or water report that person. And, sometimes they might still be there, but they were assigned a different task or something. And, clearly, I think the trend that I see now is there are some publications that, they have somebody who's doing water all the time and maybe also does energy, like, kind of your background. And, they're not kind of like, okay, we're in a drought. People are really interested in going on the drought. Let's kind of create this new, title or actually bring somebody new in.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, no, I mean, I can tell you, from my own personal experience, that is absolutely true. With the media too. I think there's, there have been efforts over the past decade or so to really build up the capacity to have full-time water reporters and, environmental reporters. And I think it's really important because coming to a story just during the drought is only going to give you a small window into the story. All these water is what's interesting to me about water is it's so place-based, and it's also so, when I covered energy, I would go to these Public Utilities Commission meetings, and there would be lobbyists and all these people, dressed up in their suits. They're, like they come with all their lawyers and corporate teams and things like that. And in water, it's so different. The way that power is distributed and the way that systems are run, there's a lot of custom that goes into it. There's a lot of institutional memory that really only one or two people maybe know about how this ditch is allocated in a certain way, and building those relationships and talking to people and understanding the context is really critical for producing good reporting and journalism or communication, storytelling of any kind. And so I think just trying to look at these places with a broader context than just what you see during the drought is really important, because a lot of these processes, whether it's a groundwater management plan or, a water sharing agreement or some kind of, even implementing data tools and things like that, it can take 10 years to negotiate something like that. It can take a really long time to work out all of the issues, and seeing that process unfold is, I think, just really illuminating. Whether 3 years of that time is a drought, 2 years is a flood year. I think that it's important to get the larger picture.
Well, having participated in some of those and had the worst year in terms of drought, single year that it occurred in Texas during the period from when we started keeping records in the mid 1800s, and have that occur when you're in the process of negotiating a big agreement. It was interesting to have that happen, because in some ways it was fortuitous, because it looked like for a while there was not going to be an agreement. It was going to fall apart. And we had this going on, right? It was summer and it was the driest year on record. And there were parties that stayed in it because they were afraid to drop out and be blamed for that process, multi-year process falling apart during the height of the worst one-year drought, right?
Yeah.
And so, so timing, they say timing is everything. Well, yes, sometimes you're right about that.
Yeah. No, I think people don't. I think it's hard for people to realize, but it really makes a big difference. I mean, Nevada is a huge state. So, Northern Nevada, the climate is different than Southern Nevada. Snow is pretty normal to see in Carson City, the capital. But 2/3, I think, of the legislature, they're from Vegas. So whenever they come to the legislative session, and they see snow on the ground, it's like, what are you talking about? We don't have enough water up here. And so these just, and I know it sounds so simplistic, but I've seen it play out. Just like how things are prioritized and discussed. It just, it's, timing is everything. And when there is a drought, I think it can be, people can see what's at stake a lot more clearly than, when everyone gets their full allocation.
So, Daniel, let's move to our last question. How can our listeners find out more about your writing on water issues?
So I think probably the best way is to check out my newsletter, which is Western Water Notes. And it is just westernwaternotes.com. That's probably the best way to check out my writing, and my email and contact information is up on there if anyone wants to get in touch.
Great. Daniel, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
This has been Talk Plus Water. My guest today was Daniel Rothberg, a writer who focuses on research on water, public lands, mining, and energy. He writes a newsletter focused on water in the Western United States. I want to thank you, the listener, for spending your valuable time on this podcast. If you have time, please, leave us a review or rate the podcast or subscribe. Finally, I want to give you a big thank you to Anna Huff at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University for getting each episode of Talk Plus Water ready to go. My name is Todd Bottler. Let's talk water again soon.